For this podcast, I have read the book titled The Bush Crime Family, the inside story of an American dynasty, in which it was authored by Roger Stone and St. John Hunt. Skipping over chapters 1 through 4 and starting with chapter 5, it is detailed how Jeb Bush started his career off in a bank that was founded by the family of James Baker. The name of this bank is the Texas Commerce Bank, and he would work for the CIA at this bank as a non-official cover agent. And of the banks that the CIA would place cover agents in, they would include the Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, and Manufacturers Hanover. Interesting connections to the Texas Commerce Bank include the fact that the Howard Hughes CIA-linked Summa Corporation used Texas Commerce Bank to purchase a number of properties on the Las Vegas Strip. At the age of 24, Jeb would act as liaison to the Venezuelan oil industry and Colombian cartels. So in effect, he would act as a conduit to forming links between the CIA and the Medellin cartel to enable the money laundering. With the proceeds from the sale of cocaine from the Colombian cartels, they would fund their war against the leftist Nicaraguans. Also, an interesting side note to the Texas Commerce Bank's entanglement with the CIA is the fact that Baker sold a skyscraper in Houston owned by the bank to the head of the National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia. And this individual's name is Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz, who would later be proven to have links to the support network created by Saudi Arabia to fund and enable terrorist attacks, such as the one that took place on 9/11. After Jeb left Venezuela in 1980, he began working for his father's presidential campaign, and he would make connections with Armando Codina, who had links to the CIA and supported anti-Castro supporters. With Jeb acting as the principal for the Codina group, he would arrange for the sale of high-priced condos in Miami to his wealthy business connections in Venezuela, most of whom were drug dealers. Another interesting fact is that Jeb Bush had a connection to an individual by the name of Orlando Bosch, who was the key figure in the CIA's Operation Condor, which was an alliance of military dictatorships in Latin America who targeted leftist leaders for assassination. Bosch also had links to the bombing of the Cubana Airlines Flight 455. This bombing was carried out with the knowledge of the CIA, given the fact that it was discussed amongst Michael Townley, who worked for the CIA, and also present for the meeting was Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles, who was known to be a Cuban terrorist. Jeb would also act as liaison between the Nicaraguan Contras and former Colonel Oliver North to fund their fighting. As governor of Florida, Jeb Bush would act as trustee over the state's pension funds and would have direct influence over how that money was invested. And in a stunning coincidence, Jeb would invest over $2 billion into financial firms who coincidentally had executives that were donating to his brother's presidential campaign. Of that $2 billion invested, $275 million was invested with the Carlyle Group, and another $150 million was invested with the Goldman Sachs company. I personally find it quite interesting that Roger Stone would write about the exploits of the Bush family and how Jeb arranged for investment contributions into Goldman Sachs, given the fact that Roger Stone is friends with Donald Trump, who has many ties to former Goldman Sachs employees, such as Kellyanne Conway, Steve Bannon, Anthony Scaramucci, and Ed Dowd, who has connections to Robert Kennedy Jr. It should also be noted that Jeb's cousin George H. Walker ran the Goldman Sachs Alternative Investment Division, and it still remains to be determined whether this position was in a non-official cover with the CIA. There are also examples of Jeb Bush engaging in pay-to-play schemes with Lehman Brothers, where he would be paid millions as a consultation fee in exchange for the pension investments made to Lehman Brothers. And it should also be noted that Lehman Brothers is at the center of the 2008 mortgage debacle crisis. In chapter 16, the authors get into how George H. Bush, also known as Poppy, entered into the CIA. Some point to the fact that Poppy's history teacher by the name of Arthur Burr Darling was an intelligence asset, while others point to the origins of his entering the CIA, having started at Yale when he was a member of the Skull and Bones. From Prescott's Skull and Bones connections, Poppy would meet Henry Neil Mallon, and from this connection, George H. Bush would get introduced to the oil business and the CIA. Meanwhile, Prescott Bush and Roland Harriman would acquire Dresser Industries, which is involved in the manufacturing of oil drill bits and equipment. And Mallon would land a job as CEO after being interviewed by George Herbert Walker. Under Mallon, Dresser would expand into manufacturing of military equipment. Through Mallon, Poppy would get hired by Dresser Industries and he would move to Odessa, Texas. Because Dresser Industry was involved in providing cover stories to the CIA for their operatives, George H. Bush would be situated in Texas and he would make many acquaintances with people in the CIA and the oil industry. At one point in time, he would act as the funder to an individual by the name of Oberby, who was basically a landman, and he would find land that was suitable to extract oil, and they would become partners. In 1953, George H. Bush would team up with William and Hugh Ledke from Tulsa, Oklahoma, to form Zapata Petroleum. In 1954, they began to pursue offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, so they formed Zapata Offshore. At the same time in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz was elected, and he was looking to place land ownership in the hands of the workers, which didn't sit well with John Foster Dulles, who sat on the board of the United Fruit Company, which did business in Guatemala. Because the company's land was seized, John Dulles would influence his brother Allen Dulles to overthrow this leader and install a brutal dictatorship that would end up ruling with an iron fist and allow foreign companies to do as they pleased. At this time, Thomas Devine, a CIA officer, would become a board member of Zapata Petroleum and Offshore. With Neil Mallon's influence, he wrote to Allen Dulles about involving Zapata Oil as a cover company, since the oil platforms could be used for training, and it is estimated that George H. Bush started his work with the CIA around 1960 or 61. There are also memos that support that on November 29, 1963, A George H. Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency was briefed by the FBI regarding the Cuban exile reaction to the JFK assassination. Also of interest is the fact that John Sherwood, who was a chief at the CIA for anti-Castro supporters, would offer up knowledge that Zapata oil was used to pay off politicians in Latin America. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, JFK would force Allen Dulles out of his job as director. And because the Dulleses and the Bushes were so close, Prescott would end up writing to Allen Dulles' widow that he would never forgive JFK for firing Allen Dulles as director. In Chapter 18, it is explored by authors to determine what connections George H. Bush would have to the JFK assassination. After much research was put into establishing that George H. Bush was connected to the CIA and later employed to the CIA and would later become director of the CIA, in the late 1950s and early 60s, the National Security Council put into effect what is known as Operation 40, which would later become the invasion force for the Bay of Pigs under Fletcher Prouty. Prouty would deliver 3 Navy ships to take part in the invasion, and the names of these ships were the Barbara, Houston, and Zapata. To fund Operation 40, Nixon would handpick businessmen to fund the operation, and those individuals were George H. Bush and Jack Crichton. In 1985, a memo dated November 29, 1963, would be made public, and it would state that Hoover, who was then the FBI director, would brief the CIA on the report to inform them of the Cuban exile reaction to the assassination of JFK. There are also documents that the FBI has made public that an individual by the name of George Bush would make a phone call to the FBI reporting an individual by the name of Milton Parrott making claims of hearsay to point the FBI in his direction regarding the JFK assassination. The address associated with this report would in fact turn out to be the address of Poppy Bush. And the FBI would end up ruling out this Milton Parrott person for any involvement in the JFK assassination. Also interesting is the fact that the FBI would not rule out officially George H. Bush for any potential involvement in the JFK assassination. It would also come to light that this Parrott individual was the opposition to George H. Bush's campaign to be the GOP chairman of the Harris County GOP. Most researchers have come to the conclusion that Poppy placed the call to the FBI to establish his whereabouts, which was Tyler, Texas, which was 100 miles away from Dealey Plaza. On the eve of JFK's assassination, Poppy would attend a party held for Oil Contractors Association meeting at the home of Clint Murchison. There for the party were Richard Nixon, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Jack Ruby, who would be the one to supply the girls for the party. There are also connections that George H. Bush had to a man named George de Mohrenschildt, and he would also end up having ties to Lee Harvey Oswald. When Poppy Bush was questioned about his connections to de Mohrenschildt, he would confirm that he knew this person, and he was the uncle of his roommate from Andover. Interestingly enough, de Mohrenschildt was also employed at Humble Oil, which was a company founded by Prescott Bush. and he would be proven to be instrumental in expanding the U.S.'s oil business in Cuba in the late 1950s while working for the Cuban Venezuelan Oil Voting Trust Company. DeMoore and Shilts would also come in contact with a J. Walton Moore, who was based out of Dallas and employed by the CIA. And he would also meet Jack Creighton, who was negotiating oil rights with the Cuban dictator Batista. It would also be substantiated that Moore would make the introduction of Oswald to DeMoore and Shilts. But why this CIA operative would want to bring a Russian sympathizer like Oswald together with a Russian native like DeMoore and Shilts, who was also employed by Prescott Bush's company, is still unknown. No one can figure out what the motives could be on the part of Moore. Coincidentally, DeMoore and Shilts would end up dead after he laid out how he came into contact with Oswald to the author Edward J. Epstein, which was the day before he was supposed to testify at the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Also interesting is the fact that Poppy Bush, as director of the CIA, requested CIA files regarding the JFK assassination numerous times. Another suspicious character with intelligence ties is an individual by the name of John Creighton, who had investments in Cuba's oil rights. He was also a commander of the 488th Military Intelligence Detachment in 1956. And according to him, many of the Dallas Police Force members were members of this Army Reserve unit. It would also be Creighton who would make the arrangements for JFK's travel to Dallas. Also of notable interest is the fact that Creighton was friends with George Lupkin, who was the deputy police chief in Dallas, and he too was a member of this force headed by Creighton. As a matter of getting into the Bush-Watergate connections, for the most part, George H. Bush can be tied to the incident by means of financially funding the operation at the request of Henry Kissinger. Because Nixon was turned down by the FBI and the CIA to investigate the leaks from the Pentagon Papers, he would form his own investigative team, and they would become known as the Plumbers. One of the members of this Plumbers team was an individual by the name of E. Howard Hunt, who was formerly employed by the CIA. So what could possibly go wrong? As for who would put up the money to fund this operation, the trail of money would be traced to individuals who had links to George H. Bush. One of those individuals was a lifelong friend and business partner by the name of Ludke, who was the president of Pennzoil. And the other person's name was Robert Mosbacher, who had worked for one of Bush's election campaigns. The money would also be transferred by Pennzoil to the committee to re-elect the president, and the checks were turned over to Maurice Stans, who worked for the committee to re-elect the president. And he would turn over the checks to Gordon Libby, who was a member of the Plumbers, and he would turn over the checks or the money to Bernard Parker, who had close ties to E. Howard Hunt, going back to Bay of Pigs. When they would become investigated over the financing of this operation, Poppy Bush would lob accusations against Bellino, who is the chief investigator, and this was done to take him off his game and create a distraction, which is kind of similar to the manner in which he had lobbed accusations against this parrot person, pointing the FBI in his direction regarding the JFK assassination. And he would be ruled out. On November 1st of 1975, there would be a shakeup in the personnel in the Ford administration, which would come to be known as the Halloween Massacre, where Secretary of Defense Schlesinger was replaced by Rumsfeld and CIA Director Colby replaced by Poppy Bush. As CIA director in the mid-1970s, Poppy would be tasked with seeking funding for operations that Congress was not going to provide funding for. So he sought funding from the Saudi Arabian government. So he would end up working closely with Kamal Adham, who was the head of the Saudi General Intelligence Division. In the wake of an assassination of King Faisal's nephew, the CIA would seize upon this incident to forge an alliance with Saudi Arabia. As CIA director, Poppy would also show much interest in obtaining files from the CIA pertaining to the JFK assassination, yet he would deny ever having done this, but the CIA would make files available to the public, confirming that he did indeed request files pertaining to the JFK assassination. With regards to the bombing of the Chilean ambassador to the United States, Orlando Letelier, it would come to light that his assassination was carried out on U.S. soil by Pinochet's Secret Service with the blessings of the CIA. One of the individuals who had links to the assassination was an operative for the CIA who was acting in allegiance with the Chilean secret police, and his name was Michael Vernon Townley. Having to run coverage for the CIA and their knowledge of the assassination, and with there being evidence pointing to the fact that the CIA was backing the Batista dictatorship, Poppy and the CIA would have to steer the FBI in the wrong direction and put suspicions on the CIA's opposition, that being the Chilean junta. This would be a prime example of how the CIA had sought to enable the assassination while acting as a source of information and expertise to steer the FBI in the wrong direction. On September 18th of 2000, the CIA would officially acknowledge that Manuel Contreras, who was the Chilean chief of intelligence, was also on the CIA's payroll, and he was behind the assassination plot. Another example of how the CIA was directly involved in acts of terrorism occurred on October 6th of 1976 when a Cuban airline leaving Barbados would have a bomb detonated, killing 73 people. They would attempt to point the fingers for this bombing at a Cuban terrorist group known as CORU. Documents pertaining to an operation called Dirty Trick would come to light, laying out a plan to commit terrorist attacks and to blame them on Cuba, which was uncovered by the Guardian. There would also be an Army memo titled Possible Actions to Provoke, Harass, and Disrupt Cuba, which gave consideration to staging airline bombings and to pin them on Cuba to create a pretext to stage war against Cuba. Also in consideration was the sinking of a U.S. warship to have reason to go to war with Cuba, which is very similar to the manner in which a U.S. warship was sunk in the Gulf of Tonkin to have a pretext to go to war in Vietnam. and also similar to the manner in which the CIA allowed for the US liberty to be attacked by the Israeli Mossad. As it would turn out, the cocaine being transported from countries like Colombia would have its roots in an individual by the name of Barry Seal. Barry had been getting arrested quite a bit in the 1970s. In 1979, he would get arrested in Honduras, traveling to Ecuador with 90 pounds of cocaine in his possession. While in prison, Barry would meet Roger Reeves, who worked for the Ochoa crime family in Medellin. At the same time, the CIA was interested in using drug cartels to fight against the leftist ideology being spread throughout Latin America. And so Felix Rodriguez convinced the cartels to donate money to the Contras. In 1982, Seal moved his operation from Louisiana to Arkansas, since Bill Clinton was providing protection, and he was on board for the transportation of these drugs into his state. In December of 1984, Barry would get arrested again in Louisiana, and he would put his hope in George H. Bush keeping him out of trouble. And Barry would end up giving testimony to Bush's task force on drugs in Washington, D.C., where he would claim that it was the Sandinistas that were responsible for the drugs being trafficked to the United States. And at the same time, Reagan and Bush would put pressure on the DEA to allow Barry to act as an informant, and they would have his airline outfitted with surveillance equipment to take pictures of everything that was going on. However, Barry would actually take pictures of Pablo Escobar loading cargo of cocaine onto a cargo plane, and it would show that he was directing the Nicaraguans and not the Sandinistas. So, however, aside from these photos existing, Reagan would go on his media campaign claiming it was the Sandinistas that were selling drugs and trafficking them to the United States, making this the basis for a pretext to go to war. However, Congressman William Hughes would find evidence to support that this claim was pure fiction created by the intel agencies. With Oliver North blowing Barry Seal's cover to the Medellin cartel, they would place a bounty on Barry, but Barry still had high hopes that the information he had on Poppy Bush would keep him out of trouble. To prove that Barry had ties to George H. Bush, he would request his attorney to place a call to a certain number and pose as him. The number would be aligned to the vice president, and he would be transferred to an admiral who would seem to know Barry, having asked, "Where have you been, Barry?" On February 19th of 1986, Barry would get shot to death, and the FBI would confiscate all his records in his car. According to author Al Martin, who had interviewed Jeb agreed it was convenient at how timely Barry would be eliminated, since he had become a liability. Jeb would also hint at threats to Martin that if any evidence he had to support his claims ever came to light, that he might suffer the same fate as Barry Seal. After Jeb won the election in 1988 for governor, he would use an attorney by the name of Neil Lewis to convey a threat to Al Martin, suggesting that if he wanted to continue enjoying life, that he would not tell stories about Jeb. In 1992, it was an election year, and the prospects for George H. Bush getting reelected looked meager. Margaret Thatcher would remind him of how the Falkland Island invasion was a gift from God, which got her elected and got her 8 more years of political power. So Poppy needed a war, and it needed to be a doozy. So he claimed to the Saudi government that the Iraqis were assembling troops in a manner to wage an attack on Saudi Arabia, which of course was a lie. By August 7th of 1992, troops were arriving in Saudi Arabia to provide support. To whip up emotional support for the war, they would use a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who was really the daughter to the Kuwaiti ambassador, and she would tell a story of how the Iraqi soldiers were ripping newborn babies out of incubators and leaving them to die. As a matter of getting into how George W. Bush's escapades and how he got his start in the oil business, George would leverage his name and business connections to accumulate $4.7 million to start a oil company by the name of Arbusto, which would go through a metamorphosis of name changes from Bush Exploration to Spectrum 7, and then to Harken Energy. While most of the money for the startup came from the Bush family, there would be a sizable amount of money that came from Salam bin Laden. And Salam bin Laden's legal representative was an individual by the name of James Bath, who would also make investments into Arbusto. Bath had also represented the Saudi government and the bin Laden family in their oil interests in the Houston area. In terms of connections James Bath had to George W. Bush, they had served in the Texas National Guard together. Along with James Bath's curious connection to the bin Laden family and the Saudi government, he also served on the board of directors for the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which has been proven to have laundered CIA money made from drug trafficking. When Arbusto was struggling financially, an associate of James Baker, who was a longtime friend of the Bush family, would buy a 10% stake of Arbusto for $1 million, which would be a $600,000 premium. This individual's name was Philip Uzelli, and he was from Panama. With oil prices at a low in the 1980s, Bush Exploration was struggling financially, and a buyout merger would be arranged with Spectrum 7, which was owned by William DeWitt and Mercer Reynolds. Mercer Reynolds would later become involved in George W.'s political campaign for the presidency, and Mercer would get appointed as ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. William DeWitt would get appointed to a position on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. In the days of the George W. Bush presidency, Marvin P. Bush was employed at Securicom, which provided security to World Trade Center, the United Airlines, and the Dulles Airport. As it would turn out, Marvin Bush was on the board of directors of an investment firm named QYAM, which financially backed Securicom, and according to Barry McDaniel, who was the CEO, their contract to provide security to the World Trade Center was to end on the day the buildings were attacked and collapsed. Also of notable interest is the fact that Jim Pierce was a cousin to George W. Bush, and he was managing director of the Aon Corporation. And they were scheduled to have a board meeting at the World Trade Center on September 11th. But at the last minute, the location for the meeting would be changed to across the street at the Millennium Hotel. When it comes to tracking the money that funded the hijackers, it has long been determined beyond a reasonable doubt that the source was from the Saudi government. There is also a Riggs Bank connection to the transfer of money. As it turns out, the Saudi princess Haifa Faisal did her banking at Riggs Bank, which is where Jonathan Bush, who is the uncle of George W. Bush, worked as an executive. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, 11 members of the bin Laden family were extracted from the U.S. with the assistance of Prince Bandar bin Sultan bin Abdul Aziz, who served as ambassador to the U.S. Other families who were extracted from the U.S. were the Royal House of Saud, who ruled over Saudi Arabia. For whatever reason, there would be some confusion as to how the extraction of these two families, both of whom have connections to the Bush family, occurred with such precision. The FBI would try to deny they had any knowledge of how these families who were extracted occurred, but Prince Bandar would go on record stating that the FBI did indeed play a role in making it happen, since all flights were grounded after the attacks took place. Interesting enough is the fact that on the very day of September 11th, Shafiq bin Laden made a $38 million investment into the Carlyle Group, which paid advisory fees to George H. Bush and James Baker. And both individuals in the following days would make a trip to Saudi Arabia on the behalf of the Carlyle Group, and they would secure another $80 million investment into the Carlyle Group. Clearly, when the Bush family is involved in crimes, they can always rely on the FBI to run coverage for them. Going back to the Iran-Contra scandal, we see it evidenced that the DEA was acting in a manner to enable the CIA and the partners who traffic drugs to the United States. We also have the FBI confiscating documents from Barry Seal's car in the wake of his death, which in some circles might be considered obstruction of justice, not to mention the fact that there is evidence pointing to the fact that Barry Seal was killed at the request of the Bush family. The Bush family has clearly established a pattern of going into politics to use the intelligence agencies to make business connections so they could prosper off of corruption and crimes committed by the intelligence agencies. From Poppy's attempt to drop a dime on a once political rival by the name of Perot for the JFK assassination to trying to facilitate connections between De Morin, Shultz, and Oswald to create the illusion Russia was behind the JFK assassination. He is seen as always trying to deflect attention away from himself, and when people become liabilities to him, he just eliminates them with the help of Oliver North. Clearly, the FBI lacks the credibility to investigate those who are politically connected and are intertwined with the CIA and their crimes. And they will also actively cover up for those who commit the crimes. Let's just look at how the FBI relies on the consultation of the CIA for their expertise in terrorist organizations and the modus operandi used in bomb makings. If they are the sole expert on a matter and have direct insight into how these groups make their bombs, wouldn't they be prone to pursue copycat bombings? To implicate their enemies to create a pretext for their next operation? There is something very wrong with this when the FBI is so willing to place such trust in the CIA, expecting them to give honest answers when you look back on their history. You can learn a lot from an analysis of history, and in investigative circles, this would be related to creating a profile, which the FBI always fails to do so when it comes to investigating the CIA, the Bush family, and the Clintons. Thank you for listening.